You're listening to the Gender Reveal Party podcast. I'm your host, Jay Pryor. This isn't your usual gender reveal party. There will be no baby sex parts. This is the real reveal, where we reveal gender through stories of brave humans willing to share their lived experience. Enjoy the listening. I sure enjoy making it. Welcome back to the Gender Reveal Party. This is your host, Jay Pryor, and I'm excited to be with you, Rhodes Perry. It's nice to see you.
Yes, it's nice to see you too. Thanks for having me here.
What is your gender identity? I was about to say this man.
Yeah, I'm a trans guy. Yeah, and I transitioned. Oh my gosh. Well, yesterday was the time that we're recording this. It's March 9th, right? So yesterday was International Women's Day. And the interesting thing about that day is 22 years ago, I was out with friends. I was in DC and we were celebrating the day. And I was interning at NOW, the National Organization for Women. I was like, I think I have something big to tell you all. I'm here, I'm like lifelong feminist and I'm here as an ally. I'm coming out to you as trans. And it was like the best, such a rad group of people. And they're like, that's awesome, So just,
That is awesome. So you're not offended by the word man?
No. Man
okay.
is, I reclaim it, and I'm all about examining toxic masculinity and constructing a way of being a man in the world that is a healthy expression of masculinity. That's where I'm coming from. And I'm working on it every day. Trying to
not only working on it, but you're also teaching other people how to do it. And that's the thing that inspires me. And that's part of why I wanted to have you on the show. Is I think it's one of the most important conversations we can engage in right now.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's interesting, thinking about models of masculinity that I grew up with, right? And there's some lovely pieces. I have an older brother. I have my dad is still in my life, really supportive, family members. And there's a lot of things about them that are kind of those healthy expressions, right? Where they didn't kind of adopt some of the nastier parts of masculinity. And then of course there's pieces where I'm like, I might do some of that a little bit differently, right? But I think my quest is to connect with other guys, just to kind of, how are you doing this differently? Or what are you thinking about? Where do you feel limited, right? Because we both do trans activism, right? And and in part, it's not necessarily out of self-interest. It's showing people hey, there are these outdated notions of gender and gender roles. And as we kind of think about things that we're just implicitly accepting, how does that limit each person that we kind of connect with? How does it limit you in being fully self-actualized? What are things that you always wanted to do, but maybe you told yourself, oh, I can't do that because I'm a woman, or I can't do that because I'm a guy.
Right.
And hopefully, it's part of the road to liberation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of my goal of the podcast, is for people to really get how nuanced gender is and how fluid it is and what's possible inside of that. There's so much expression inside of that spectrum, right? And it just feels and especially, and this is a thing that I know that you and I have in common, and me going off testosterone has given me a different view of this, right? But we went on testosterone around the same time. My first shot was April 1st, 2001.
Yeah.
So we went on testosterone at the same time. I was on 18 years and came off. But you and I both have this history of being a feminist, right? Totally. And then being handed white male privilege.
Yep.
Right. And for me, I talk about this when I speak. For me, I'm embarrassed to say how shocked I was, right? I was so embarrassed because I thought that I knew this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? How was that? Was that your experience also? Did you have awakening for yourself? Around privilege, your own male privilege, when it was handed to you?
Totally. Yeah. I think it's weird, right? Because for when I went to college, I was one of the majors that I focused on was gender studies, right? So gender studies meets economics. So I like I thought about like impacts of the patriarchy or white supremacy culture, like all of that. So in theory, right, it's like I understand it, and I knew how it impacted me, being socialized as a girl and young woman. Um, Certainly having white privilege from the time of birth, right?
Right.
Um, but like how white male privilege operates in the world, I think what was most like that it's like visceral, I can still remember because there's a lot of things that I can forget, right? But like two of the things that just immediately come to mind are, especially living in DC, just kind of like walking in a city anywhere, right? And that feeling of unsafety. But also like catcalling, which was, it would just like get me so mad.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of like, it was like an atmosphere of violence. Like it was like the threat, of just like it's happening, oh, just smile, all that kind of stuff when you're walking down the street. In the moment that people started to read me in the way that I felt inside and outside, right? Like it just went silent, like walking down the street, it was kind of like, what's happening? Like for like probably the first year and a half, it was very odd,
Mhm.
not to be harassed in such a way that just, I don't know, like, so that was one thing. And I think the other thing, which I think is kind of funny, it still happens now, is that perceived, everything, right? Like, hey, Rhodes, I have a flat tire. Can you fix it? I'm like, I have no mechanical capabilities at all. I'm sorry, I wasn't socialized that way. I wasn't expected to fix things. And it's funny, even my partner does it sometimes where I'm like, I don't know how to fix this. I can't fix like the hard drive of our computer, right? But it's just the assumed competence in everything.
Yeah.
It's that was that even it's very trippy, right?
Well, it's
And
interesting
so
to me because that shocked me, but then there's also an assumed incompetence.
right,
Right.
if you're not male, right? Is that
Well,
what
no,
you're
if you
correct?
are male, at least for
Oh,
me, well,
right.
and you haven't had the experience of, I don't know if you have kids. I have kids. And so therefore I'm incompetent to deal with anything
Yes,
child. Like I
gotcha.
just assume that I don't change a diaper. I'm assumed that I don't, that,
Yes,
and people
yeah,
have,
yeah,
when
I get what
she's out and about, when
yeah,
with me, they say, like when I'm out and about, nobody ever says who's with the kids. When
yes,
she's out and about, they say who's with the kids.
yes,
It's like,
okay,
well, because
yes,
Jay's
yeah,
incompetent because
yep,
they think I'm a male, so they think, well, there must, you know, so there's
yes,
that.
I totally get what you're saying. So it's like I think and my partner gets on me about this, like the helplessness, the assumed like, like,
Yes.
oh, like where's the
It's
cinnamon? I can't see, like
such
kind
a
of,
racket.
yeah, yeah, that is real too, right? And so like those two things, like I think are really, really big. And like it acts of allyship, and I think of being in space and like centering the voices of women, when hearing women share experiences of assumed like it, and most of my work is in like workplace settings, but like,
Mhm.
assumed incompetence on the part of women, or the paternalistic, we men know better, and kind of the silencing or the talking over, the taking of the
The
credit.
mansplaining.
Right, exactly. Just to kind of like, as a guy affirming like this is real, this is happening, male privilege exists. Like, I mean, I don't think that, I mean, for me, I don't think I can say it enough in
No.
spaces. And it's just like, I think for some women, and it's probably infuriating for people that are listening of like, duh, right? This is real. It happens all the time. Yet I find in those public settings, like that kind of affirmation for some people, it's the first time that like a guy has said that, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I
That's my
think that,
experience too. I mean, because I do it a lot in my speaking and work with women executives and,
yep,
especially in a coaching setting too, because there's very specific examples that I am
yep,
very clear that if my client was a man, that would not have happened.
yeah,
Like I'm just 100%
yeah,
know that, especially having walked through that world, that I'm like, oh, there's no way that that would happen if you were not female, right?
yeah,
Expressing. So, right.
yeah,
So, yeah. And then I've had the other interesting, I think, fun conversations sometimes. And I've got another friend of mine coming on soon to talk about this, are my trans women friends who, this one in particular was in tech,
oh yeah,
right?
yep,
So once she transitioned, then all her male counterparts started asking her if she needed help.
Mm.
Same person on the same job,
Yep.
right? But that's how the training is so deep, right? That it's not like it's something that's conscious,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And I think like that it's really powerful what you're creating here on your show, right? Of just kind of lifting up stories like your friends, like sharing common experiences that we have, where it's like we've lived very interesting lives that
Mhm.
like and everybody's life is different and there's different experiences that are specific and unique and all of that good stuff. I think there's a real space for our voices in this conversation around gender inclusiveness in the workplace, where it's just like it's just sharing and validating, right?
Mhm.
um Experiences that sometimes, just the phenomenon of gaslighting and, oh no, that's not really happening here, it's just like, no, it is, and let's just like start
Yes.
talking about it, and not using euphemism but just being really direct and sharing those experiences,
Right.
so we know what we don't want anymore, right? And
Right.
we start orienting to something that's like better.
And also,
Right.
like you said, that you can, so we can, well, for me anyway, that I can see it, like as I, and again, this, it was significant for me. Always I identified as a genderqueer, but then
Mhm.
going off testosterone, I just feel so much more like, okay, I can see clearly now
Yeah.
a lot better.
Yeah.
But, or, and should I say that this conversation is about, casting that net of understanding so that every single human can grasp. And for me, living in that world of privilege over and over and over again, I felt like I started to be that,
Yeah.
right? And I felt like that was line, and it still can happen where, I have friends like, I have one of my besties that's a cis heterosexual, all the binary, right? And we had a interesting time one time when, I mean, early on our relationship, when she was like flirted with me to get me to do something, right?
Yeah.
Or started to, and I just looked at her like,
What's
I don't have
happening?
a penis, right? Like, there's no response over here to that, right? But the way male female dynamics play themselves out in that
Mhm.
way, like
Yeah.
we have this front row seat to this. And so I agree that there's this conversation that we can have that really hopefully gives people a new lens. That's my goal. I just want to give
Yeah.
people a new lens, right? With a
Yeah.
decent seat.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think like, yeah, I think you do it every day. I hope like there's ways that I can kind of provide a perspective that's a little bit different. And
Well, some of the training you do, I mean, I don't want you to I want to make sure we have people go buy your books, because this is an author and a speaker and a podcaster here that we're talking to people. So I want to make sure that you go get his books. But one of the things that I'm hearing both in the workplace, but also just out in the world, and I think our audience is prime for this conversation right now, that I think you help people with, is also this navigating the world of gender and not and being able to be somebody who's heteronormative and binary, and navigating the world of race and gender without fragility and without, what I'm hearing is, I don't want to offend anybody, so I just don't talk to them.
mm,
Right.
yes.
Right. And that does not create belonging, right? That just breaks
Oh,
your heart. And
yes.
so part of what you do is help in that conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, I think there's like a couple of things in what you just shared. I mean, I think the first is just um recognizing the complexities that each of us have, right? Like where we hold power and where we might, based off of like social identities that we hold, right? So, for any one of your listeners, just thinking about, like we're talking about like on the conversation about gender, right? Like I'm sure there's a swirly mix of different gender identities and the way we express our gender, right? Those are just like two aspects that describe us, right? But then you think about your racial identity, or where you grew up, were you a citizen of the United States, did you immigrate here, did your parents immigrate here, did you go to college? Did you not? I mean, there's so many different places where
What's your
you might
ACEs
have some
score?
power. Yeah, right. And it's you know, and
Trauma.
it's all contextual, right? So in some social circles, whether it's your workplace or your community or your family, you might hold more power than if you change that environment, right? And it's being really aware of that, like knowing who's around you, and knowing when you might need someone to engage in acts of allyship for you, and when you can do that for other people. And I think on the second piece that you said, just the fear of getting it wrong, you
Yeah.
know, that's a trait of white supremacy culture that I would encourage
Okay.
everybody just to kind of poke holes in, because it's
Yeah.
about perfectionism.
Right.
And like, guess what?
Yeah.
Nobody,
Let's get over
myself
that.
included, nobody's perfect, right?
Right.
And if you really care about building connections across differences, it's going to be messy, right? I mean, just think of like if anybody's traveled to another country, totally different culture, totally different customs, like even if you're trying to be respectful and speak that language, you might be saying things exactly the way that it would translate, but you could say something in a way that causes offense. You're not going to stop trying, right? Just
Right.
because you tripped up, you're gonna internalize that, you're gonna learn from it, and that's where you grow, you know.
Right.
And so I think like, you know, just thinking about whether it's your workplace or your community, um, the because you're trying, right? Like that goes so much further. And
Right.
right now, so many of us need allies in those different contexts.
We
And the
sure do.
probably the worst thing that we could do is just remain silent because we're fearful of getting it wrong. So maybe like if there's one takeaway from this conversation, just keep trying, please.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying every day and I learn something new every day.
I
And I
learn something new every day too.
right.
And I
Yeah,
step in it probably every day. I mean, I
right.
probably do. I probably goof up every day. I mean, it feels like I
Sure.
do.
Yeah,
For sure.
right.
You
But
know,
like,
I mean,
you know,
like,
right.
yeah,
But Jay, like when you do, right? Like if someone's like, oh, ouch, you know, hey, when you
yeah,
said this, here's how it landed for me. Like, don't you
yeah.
remember it the next time
Oh
you're like,
God,
oh, right,
always. I never
you
do. And
know?
fortunately, I have friends who are just like, I don't have that option. And I'm like, you're right. I'm sorry. I'm moving on.
Yeah,
Fortunately, we surround ourselves with people who are I always surround myself with people who are smarter than me. So I really
yeah,
do. And it's part of my
right.
strategy of life.
No,
Surround
me
yourself by
too.
people who are smarter than you
Me
so that
too.
you're always growing. But
Yeah,
yeah, because I get called, and I don't have to get called out most of the time. I just get, it's like, oh crap, move on. Okay, here we go.
yeah,
And that's why I always tell people about my pronouns and my stuff. It's like, just keep going. Whatever you do, don't make a big deal out of it because that really
yeah.
and that
And
whole perfectionist piece, though, this is why I always learn something when I'm with you. Again, I hadn't considered the white supremacy piece because that's a whole world that I'm still waking up in myself.
yeah, I mean,
So I
there's so much.
appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's stuff, the work of Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones came out like 20 years ago. So like in activisty spaces where they examined like how does white supremacy culture impact like our views of what professionalism is. And they came up with these 14 traits. And that's actually included in this book that I just put out, was like lifting up that work,
Nice.
because it's super, super important when we think about, you know, whether it's like how professional are we at work, or like when we're evaluating other people, we're actually propping up some of these traits that many of our workplaces are now thinking we want to engage, we want to build an anti-racist organization.
Yeah.
Guess what? Like we have to like start like stripping away some of these like traits that, because we're passing them along to like future leaders, like it's
Right.
not, it's doing a disservice to all of us.
Right.
And I think if you look at any of those traits, especially as it meets like, you know, many folks that are listening here are women, right? You know,
Right.
like, I mean, white supremacy culture is married to the patriarchy in so many ways, right? Like paternalism and kind of like, you know, one right way of doing things like that have excluded so many of us, you know, on our work teams or elsewhere. So anyway, I encourage anybody to check out that work because it's really powerful. And I mean, I have the list in front of me just thinking of like, okay, how am I not doing this today?
Yeah.
Right. And it's actively unlearning so many things that when I was a younger professional being trained, it's like, oh, right, like that's what I was taught. But like, here's how it harms me. And here's how this harms so many of my friends and colleagues. So it's ongoing work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all unraveling. I mean, I think our job is to unlearn everything we wired ourselves up to keep us safe to learn, like that's part of our job is right. Unlearning
Yeah,
all of that, all
yeah.
of that. So
And
we
doing
can
it publicly.
fully self-express, if
Yeah,
nothing
right.
else. Right.
Totally. And like, I mean, the power of, like for you holding space with like people that you work with, there's power in that of like, real time. If someone's like, hey Jay, when you said this, here's how it landed for me. Like you can model that public learning moment of like, oh my gosh, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I didn't realize it.
Mhm.
And this was a gift. Like you gave this feedback to me, and here's what I'm going to do different. Boom.
Sure.
Just like, I mean, if every leader did something like that every day, I don't know, at least there's some space to start healing from a lot of the harms that so many of us experience too
Yeah.
often. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So as a masculine human, but like when you're in a company, for example,
Mhm.
w- do you come out as a trans man, or are you stealth and they see you at, because if you don't come out to them, then they're going to perceive you
Mhm.
as, and especially if you talk about your spouse who is a cis woman, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So then you're going to be perceived as a white straight dude.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do, well, it's kind of funny because I mean, everywhere, if you Googled me, if you read my book, like nowhere am I like stealth in any of the work, right? But
Right.
then there's like that implicit, right? Like so many of us
Right.
who are queer,
Oh,
like
that's why I
we're
talk.
assumed
Yeah.
straight until we come out,
I come out over and over and over and over and over
yes,
and
the
over and over.
ongoing,
I come
yeah,
out every 5 minutes to people,
totally,
and then
right?
they still forget.
Yeah. So like for all of the LGBTQ folks in your audience is like, yeah. And
Yeah.
then for everybody else is like, oh, right, this is not like a one-time moment. So what I do, I tend to do, right? Unless people are like, hey, Rhodes, you're trans, come in, do a trans 101, which I
Right.
typically don't do in my work, but unless like it's a part of something bigger, right? But
Sure.
what I do is actual purposeful disclosure. So I let people experience me and however they experience. And I'm assuming that maybe they've done some research. So like maybe they know that I'm trans, maybe they don't. But when there's the opportunity to kind of share more, and oftentimes we do this in like when I do exercises around kind of like thinking about where we hold power because of who we are and where we don't. I always use myself as an example. So we get to like gender identity or sexual orientation. And I'm like, so my gender history, I was assigned female at birth and I was socialized as a girl and young woman. I'm a trans guy, and I leave some room for people to understand that. And then when we get to the space of assumptions and unconscious bias, it's a really powerful learning tool.
Nice.
Um, and it's interesting because it's those moments of vulnerability, right? Like I'm sure your audience loves Brene Brown. I love her, right? But it's just kind
Who
of those
doesn't love
moments,
Brene
right? I
Brown?
know, right? Yeah, lots of love, right? It's like that power of vulnerability. You do something like that
Yes.
publicly,
Yes.
and I'm moving towards like the people I'm working with.
Yeah.
It's amazing how they start to lower like their waterline, or they
Mhm.
start to like
Oh yeah,
uncover like the things that are most precious to them
for sure.
because it's like creating safer space as we go. We're like
Yeah.
we're building trust as we move along in the process.
Yeah.
And I think like that's where some real powerful awakenings happen. So it's like kind of a gift, um, but I never really leave an engagement not making sure that people know like aspects of my gender history, knowing that I'm a trans person, like, and connecting that to what's happening to our communities in this country and around the world, and like connecting it to why that's a business concern when we
Mhm.
think about younger generations and the future of work. So
Mhm.
so that's what I do. But and it's interesting because I like watching, I'm sure like in the work that you do too, to seeing like reactions of people of like, oh, they were assuming something over there, that
Oh yeah.
and kind of unpacking that too. And
Oh
it's
yeah. It's fun
yeah.
to. It's fun to. It's definitely fun to unpack that. I have done it all. I did it. Because I have always, again, been 100% out, and no matter if you're with me 5 seconds, I'm going to tell you how out I am.
Yeah.
But when I started my coaching business, like it's not about me, right? And this is about them and their lives. And so I wasn't necessarily out to some of my clients until I wrote my first book. And I was like, I have to tell some of these clients because it's coming out in the book, but it just hasn't been a conversation, right? I mean, I see that I talk to them twice a month about their lives.
Yeah,
I'm not taking up their 50 minutes for my life, right?
exactly.
I let them assume whatever the hell they want. It's just like, it wasn't my thing. So,
Yeah.
so it was interesting to then go back to my clients who I'd been with and then have that conversation. But when I
Yeah.
started doing seminars for women,
Yeah.
I flipped it because when I initially did it, I would go through the whole seminar. And at the
Mm.
very end, I would let them know. And by the way, I know what it's like to be you because I've been there. And, you
Yeah.
know, and then at somewhere along the line, I ended up like starting from there
Yeah.
as more of a credibility sort of, I know this is who I am. And especially because I got so much pushback around, especially in my hometown. I'm in a small town. I like to own my backyard. So in my hometown, initially when people saw me, especially when I was super butch, everybody was like, "What does that dude think he has to say to women?" And I was like, "Well, let me tell you." I got all kinds of things to say to women. So that's how that kind of flipped out. But yeah, what was always fascinating to me though, and it seems less now because of I think the non-binary conversation exists in the world and we have expanded as a universe, right? Amen.
Yes.
But especially how often I came out to people, but then they forget immediately. It just
Yeah.
does not resonate. They could not see me as anything but man. And
Yeah.
so therefore related to me as men.
Yeah.
And so,
I get that. Yeah, I
yeah,
get that. And like it's constant. I find myself constantly bringing it back into the conversation,
me too.
because I notice where there's discomfort, and
Hmm.
it's just proximity, right?
Yeah.
Like people,
Oh,
they're not lucky
oh,
enough to have like best friends like us. You know what
oh
I
no,
mean?
no. And I have
Yeah.
I feel so blessed because I've had that mouth that since I was 18 was like, I have to be out or I die.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
that was my,
Yeah.
once I figured out, came out, I was like, oh, well, shit, that's how I stay alive. Is I just be out.
Yes.
I
Same.
I can't
Yeah.
I can't be hiding that bushel light under a bushel anywhere,
Yeah.
and so from that point on, me coming out has always been, I mean, I've always been out, 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 right?
Right.
And the trans thing was weird for me and hard for me because I disappeared as a butch dyke.
Yeah.
That part was like, what?
Yeah. Yeah. That's Yeah, is it like in a way it's like losing, I mean, I felt there was a grieving process of losing a community that I like recently discovered, right? So it's like I came out at
Yes,
18, right? And so I'm like,
yes,
I'm a lesbian, I finally figured it out, right? And
yeah,
it's like, well, that was like important information, but that's not all of me, right?
right,
And it's like, oh wait, this was more about gender, right?
right,
And but like there was this period, right, of like 18 to like 2021, where it's like finding like being in like a women's community with like queer women, and see it's such a special, like that is such a special sacred place,
yeah,
for cis trans women, right? Like, and it's sacred, and and for me, in the way that I kind of like found my way to myself is like I'm an ally of this community, and I know how important it is. And for me to be myself, I couldn't be in the community, so I had to like grieve that, and then realize, like if I need community, I'm gonna have to like seek it out. I'm gonna have to like create something, with other people that get like experiences that are kind of like ours.
yeah,
And everybody's super different, right? So
right.
it's kind of, I don't know, it's like I'm still on that quest of building community, and I'm really grateful for people like you and other people that I've been connected to over this like past 20 years of
Right.
really,
If you stay
finding words,
alive and stay out and you start
staying
to
alive.
know people for a long
Yeah,
time, all right? I
right.
mean, I haven't had to tap any, I have very few people that I have had conversations with that aren't already friends of mine
Yeah,
on the gender reveal party. It's like I know a bunch of cool queers.
yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. It's good. Yeah. I mean,
Cool
like,
gender queers. I know a ton of cool gender queers. This is
yeah,
fun. Right.
yeah. And like lifting up stories that, like don't often have a platform like yours, so
Yeah.
it's And I think that, especially for the audience that you have, just kind of like being connected to really great people and like just the different perspective in life that I think helps all of us get a little more free, where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, right, like we are each trying to self actualize, and to get there is such a, when you can really own all parts of yourself and not be ashamed of them, but just to see them as like the superpowers that they are. I don't know. I mean, I feel like that's some of the gifts of our communities, where we're like just unapologetically being ourselves in the midst of a lot of hate and, misguided people. I mean, that might be generous to say, but still be like unflappable, like there's like this year I always do some kind of like commitment statement to myself, and this year was like channeling the energy of the mountain, so
Mm,
like this kind of like steady, courageous, strong like entity in the midst of whatever. It could be like an avalanche, a blizzard, it could be a beautiful day, but it's like just being there and being true. And I feel like this year, I don't know, I'm glad I'm channeling that mountain energy, because I really I'm needing it right now, because it's hard. I think it's hard for many of us for so many reasons, whether
right.
like internationally looking at what's happening in Ukraine, or here in the United States for those of us who are trans and non-binary. It's there's it's really important, for anybody who's listening to your show. Like if you have any kind of positional power, which I feel like everybody does, finding ways to speak out at what's happening at the expense of kids, like young kids in supportive homes who are trans and non-binary, that unfortunately are at the crosshairs of like a political game, that just feel like their lives are just collateral damage, for some people, and it's wrong. It's really wrong. So channeling that mountain energy to push back against that, that's where I'm at right now. But I'm curious for you, like how is this landing for you? And I don't know, now I feel like I'm interviewing you, but I
No, 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 it's okay. My job has always been to love the transphobia out of people.
yeah,
So I have to stay in love, and
yeah,
I have to do everything I can to stay spiritually grounded so I can stay in love. Because
yeah,
if I watch too much news or I listen to too much of it, then I can get caught up in my head, and my
yeah,
head is not a safe place to be.
yeah,
So, and my natural trauma response or fear response is to fight. I'm a
mhm,
fighter
yeah,
by nature, and I'll fight in my head. I'll even stay stirred up in my head, which
yeah,
raises my cortisol, and that doesn't help anybody because I need to live a long time because I still got a big difference to make. So, so
I love that.
so what I do is I meditate, and I have a couple of groups that I go to that remind me that who I am is love, and I interview amazing humans like you, and I just stay focused on putting love and love content out because I'm of the mind of Mother Teresa, who said, I'll never go to an anti-war rally, but when you have a peace rally, give me a call. Right?
Yes.
Because pushing against it, right, so it make what we resist persist, what we push against. So when I get into my head, I start pushing against, and I feel horrible, and then I can't make the difference and I want to make. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my whole strategy is always to stay spiritually grounded and to
Yeah.
continue to love and be love and show up, and then give money and raise voices of people who can make a difference. I have people like you on the show. I have Debbie Jackson,
Yeah.
who works for HRC, as a friend of mine, and she's been on the show. And we've had my friend Chris Hampton, who works for the ACLU and manages the Facebook pages of these kids in these suits. And if I'm just like, I want to get their voices out there, because
Sweet.
they're the ones who are smart enough to talk to this. I
Yes.
just
Yeah.
I'm the one who can hold the container of love for all the kids.
Yeah.
And I think everybody has their job to do, right? And
Yeah.
my job is to like be the container of love and keep putting out creative content that has people hopefully engage and think a little
Absolutely.
different. So
Absolutely. I love what you're saying about kind of like being in that space of, you know, just love, right? And not kind of like fighting against something which only strengthens that you don't want to see more of,
mhm.
right?
Yeah,
And
what we resist persists.
Yeah, I like that.
And what we focus on gets bigger. And we know that because, I mean, look at one of Donald Trump's best things he's good at is getting people to focus on him. And
yes.
so if you think about how much energy everybody focuses on this guy, it just continues to have momentum.
Yeah.
Right. And so what we focus on, we build momentum on. It's like it will always take up space and energy in our lives. So the best thing we could do, when I don't know if you're familiar with Fred Phelps, who used to be in, yeah,
Yeah.
it's okay. But I'm from Kansas, right? And I was in college when Fred Phelps started to picket gay men's funerals. And I was the president of the gay student organization. And actually had a radio. I was on the radio with Fred Phelps.
Wow.
Right. And that was when it first started. Right. And we were all like, we were on one corner and he was on another corner. And I mean, I was right there with Fred Phelps. I used to go talk to him at NGLTF conferences. When I'd go to the conference, I'd go up to Fred. Hey, Fred. He'd go, hey, Janet. We knew each other. Like, so I know the family. It's like, I know him. I knew him in person. But what we finally figured out about Fred Phelps was the best way to deal with Fred Phelps was to ignore him.
Yeah.
And people started like having contests of how long they could go without looking at them or without, like giving them any attention. And, it's like, if we could do that with Donald Trump, we'd all be a lot better off. The guy just is really good at getting attention. What we focus on always gets bigger. What we resist persists. So my goal is to focus on the love and then really affirm and lift up the people who I know are really qualified and trained to handle these things.
Yes.
If I get stirred up in the worry and then I'll cry a lot and I'll gnash my teeth and freak out. And
totally,
it's just got to stay in that lane of love.
Yeah. And like and what you're talking about, like the cortisol hormones versus like, being in that space of the dopamine, and like the happy hormones, like we could use more of that. So I'm gonna be
I 100% know that 10 years because of you and because of me and because of all the stuff we did 20 years ago up until now, I know that 20 years from now, these kids are gonna be great.
Oh yeah.
Be fine.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm excited.
I'm holding that. I'm holding that. I call that holding the high watch. That's how I've learned it. Hold the high watch. I hold that vision.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think like, one of the things that I do with the folks that I work with is just kind of reminding them of like what we know about Gen Z and future generations. And like Gen Z is really fascinating, right? It's like 33% are identifying as something other than straight. 25% are expected to transition their gender in some way over the course of their lifetime. And it's like, that's a huge number of young people already in the workforce, right? So it's just like, usually when I share those stats, that's kind of people get more interested of like, oh, we are not prepared. It's like, and they're really discerning, right? They're very values focused. So it's like,
right, they're not going to work for you.
Exactly.
They're just not going to work for you. I keep telling people that. Like you can ignore this all you want, but you're going to run out of talent pretty soon because they won't work for you. Like if you don't have this stuff dialed in, they're not going to work for you.
Yeah. And they're super smart and savvy. It's like they might create businesses of their own that will compete against yours too.
Exactly. So they are very smart and very savvy. And they're also, there's just this, because my kids are Gen Zs and I have one that's, a special needs kiddo, but my other one is a non-binary, initially came out to us as trans and wanted male pronouns and now is non-binary and all the pronouns. And really is like, who cares about all that? Like we don't think about that a lot, but they have a lot of friends that are non-binary and queer and trans and blah, and they're all just they don't care. Like it's not a thing, right? They're not focused on that kind of stuff, and we're in Kansas. So, I mean, we're getting there and they are 11 and 12 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating. That's
really, it's just, they're not. But they also have this really interesting sense of like, I can just go learn how to do that on YouTube.
Yeah. Oh, right.
You know what I mean? Like they don't need people to, it's an interesting world because I'm 56. So I come from a world and I grew up in a town that was basically 20 years behind. We were chiseling tablets back there. But, but there was still that world of like internships and apprenticeships and stuff that then went away. And now these kids are like, well, I can YouTube video anything I ever want to learn.
Yeah.
My kid takes a musical instrument, goes into their room, and 2 hours later comes out and can play it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Because I mean, he can go
Yeah,
hyper focus on this YouTube TV and
yeah,
learn anything you want.
yeah, yeah.
So
There's like a real democratization of knowledge that's out there, right?
yeah,
And
it's pretty interesting.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, right
this
on.
is fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been fun. Can we are you gonna do a TED talk? Because you got these books and like do you have a TED talk coming or something? I just feel that. Is that coming?
I've
Am I
got,
am I
yeah,
telling tales of something? Am I that's
well,
my
I welcome
intuition
it.
just said TED
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have like I do like like keynotes, right,
Yeah.
for a lot of organizations. Um, I don't know if you've got someone in your audience who's interested in extending an invite, I welcome it. I
I'm feeling
definitely,
that for you.
yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Like, yes, we're gonna make
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
happen.
TED
Yeah,
talk by Rhodes. Yeah,
cool.
for
I'd
sure.
love it. I'd love
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
definitely.
Um, yeah, but not right now, like the big thing, I've got a new podcast coming out called Imagine Belonging at Work. And it's taken a lot of the content from this most recent book and kind of making it come to life and talking
Nice.
with like lots of thought leaders like you and other folks. And it builds off of the last podcast that I had, which was the Out Entrepreneur. I'm excited about this one because it's like bringing in LGBTQ voices and then
Mhm.
so many other people that are
Sure, right?
focusing on, the power of creating connection at work, right? Like who would have thought like actually having like healthy relationships at work is good for business, right?
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
but I think more
It's really
people,
powerful. And it's also just from a business perspective, right? It's because I work with small niche, like niche agencies, for example. Like I work in ad agencies and they're small, like 10 to 22 people.
yeah,
So, when me and my team come in, we have the whole company. Right? We get to hold the whole company and build this culture with the whole company.
yes,
And we can do that right now on Zoom, right?
mhm,
We can do that 22-person company on Zoom.
yeah,
When you get into these big corporations like you're talking to in these bigger groups,
mhm,
that becomes a much more difficult conversation, especially on Zoom and the way the world's going with remote and all that kind of stuff. So they need your podcast. And I think that the podcast is also going to be a great add-on for your consulting business because, people when they're not working with you can be listening and learning. So
yeah.
right
Thank
on,
you.
man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's fun. It's fun to
Yeah.
get content out in interesting ways, and especially working with people that want they're hungry for they're ready for the how, right? And I think
Yes.
sometimes people overcomplicate what the how is, right? And so just kind of like breaking things down, like first just reminding people like no matter what your role is, you hold you hold some level of power and influence, whether you want to see that or not. I think
Right.
first acknowledging that and then recognizing that some of these actions are quite simple, right? Like even in kind of the words that we use, I know we were talking about pronouns before we hit record, right? But just kind of like modeling, really inclusive behaviors, starting with yourself. Hey, I'm Rhodes. I use he, him, his pronouns. Who are you? Would you like to share your pronouns? Like,
Mhm.
just as leaders, there's so many little things that sometimes we get in our own way by overcomplicating, thinking we have to have this massive, comprehensive strategic plan and everyone has to sign on to it. And sure, that might be helpful. And
Right.
maybe starting with some simpler actions that actually helps you do your job better,
Right.
right? Instead of making it feel like we're asking people to do something extra, which we're not,
Right.
so it's kind of fun, and especially like seeing when people get it, it's like,
Yeah.
yes, okay,
Right.
you got it,
Yeah. Yeah.
you're
Because
doing it.
people want to be people want to belong and people want to be inclusive. Like
Yeah,
they want to help people belong. I really do think that. And
yeah,
I think we get in our own way. We get all freaked out, you
yeah,
know, how we get all freaked out about how and what and what if I disappoint somebody or embarrass myself or,
yeah,
have to experience shame.
yeah, right. And that's, yeah, like when you think about like this thing of exclusion, right? It's kind of like all of the things that we don't want, which is like disconnection, discouragement, shame, it's like, and I think the starting place, and it kind of goes back to what you were talking about before, is like we have to give ourselves permission to take some risks, some calculated risks, and be okay if it's not perfect, right? And be okay if we actually get feedback where it's like, hey, Rhodes, like when you said this, I know that you might have had good intentions, and here's some information that might help you in the future. That's maybe the ideal feedback that we get, or we would want to get. And sometimes the feedback comes at us in a way that feels kind of like an attack. And if we can see like that kernel of truth in it, and how we can show up as better versions of ourselves as leaders, it's kind of amazing, like if you're just open to it, and even if you're scared, just kind of continue to do it, and just kind of look at the fear on your shoulder and say, I see you. You're going to go over here for now. I'm going to try something different. And that might be harder for some of us. I'm 42. I'm already feeling set in some of my ways, and I'm like, wait a second, don't do that. my brain is plastic. It can be rewired. So
completely. I hear stuff coming out of my mouth. I'm like, what in the hell?
Yeah, like I sound like my parents. Oh no, it's happening. And we're wired to change. We're wired to like not just change, but like transform. And I think that's some of what we're facing right now, is like what we're living through is not really, we talk about change this and change that. We're really transforming, and it's like two elements that come together, spontaneously combust, and there's a brand new element. Like we're living through that.
Yeah.
So
100%.
I think it's a good thing if
one of my spiritual teachers just gave this analogy the other day, and I had never heard. I was just like, oh, I love this. But she was talking about how when energy moves as fast as it's moving now, and if you think about technology, how fast, right, we've moved in the last 7 years. She said when energy is moving that fast, either you go with the energy, right, and you expand, or you get caught in the brambles, right?
Yeah.
And when you're caught in the bramble, so as we expand and we're moving fast, the rich are getting richer faster, the poor are getting poorer, like it's going so fast like that. And she says it's going to cause extremes. And that made me feel like, whoa, that's a different perspective, right? For me to examine and think about, right? We are in expansive and we're moving fast, and boy, and it's like you gotta to some degree like let go and go with it, right? And you're gonna hit some rocks along the way.
Sure.
Because it's moving fast.
It really is.
It really fast.
And it definitely is. So,
well, buddy, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you too.
Where can we find you? RhodesPerry.com or
that's the best place. RhodesPerry.com. Yeah. Okay. This was awesome, Jay. Thank you for having me. Thank you for what you're building here too. It's amazing. And thanks for your audience for listening to us. Really
I love our audience.
Yeah.
See you, buddy.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye. Hey, thanks for listening to the Gender Reveal Party podcast. I hope you loved it. And if you did, would you take a second and go do all the things like subscribe, rate, review, tell all your friends. Apparently, if you do that, the podcast platforms are more likely to share it. And if you think these stories are important, please take 3 minutes to just go do that. I'd really appreciate it. Also, I'd love to connect with you on social. On Instagram and Facebook, I'm at the Gender Reveal Party. And on Twitter, I'm at PriorJ. It's a real joy and privilege to bring you this podcast. Come back soon. Love you, bye.